little bit about Tempest. Tempest Collective is a socialist organization that aims to create a space for the left to come together to discuss and to debate. Our goal is to put forward a revolutionary vision that is clear and understandable, that weighs in on strategic and tactical questions and offers concrete guidance as well as political theory, and presents a consistent set of working class politics from below. So today we're going to hear from 4 speakers. Just 2 years following the anti-racist uprisings in the wake of George Floyd's murder, an emboldened political right has made enormous gains. We've seen the reversal of Roe, the recentering of law and order politics, and legislative attacks on queer and trans people. Meanwhile, we're experiencing an economic fallout that's stemming from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, international imperialist ventures, and an accelerating climate crisis. And this has worsened life for ordinary people around the globe. Certainly, we are living in strange times. So we're going to hear from our presenters first. Each will speak for about 10 minutes. Following the presentations, there will be ample time for discussion. Questions can be raised, participants can debate back and forth, and I imagine our presenters will want to weigh in again at the end. So we're going to hear first from Ashley Smith. Ashley is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America in Burlington, Vermont. He has written in numerous publications, including Tempest, Spectre, Truthout, Jacobin, and New Politics. Following Ashley, we're going to hear from Andy Sernatinger, a socialist labor activist and a frequent writer on issues in the Democratic Socialists of America. Following Andy, we'll hear from Kristen Godfrey, a Black non-binary community organizer and social worker who has worked alongside LGBTQ+ young people in after-school programs, community resource centers, and in higher ed for 9 years. In addition to her membership with the Tempest Collective, she is a co-founding member of Thompson House Tucson, which is a socialist organization and mutual aid collective. Finally, we will hear from Elizabeth Lalasz, a registered nurse and steward with National Nurses United. She is a member of the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America labor branch, and all of our speakers today are also members of the Tempest Collective. So with that said, I'm going to throw it over to Ashley to begin us.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for everybody for joining us. I think the last time I spoke for the Tempest Collective was at our convention. I always get the cheery topics, and the last time I spoke about what I called the 5 horsemen of today's apocalypse, which is the 5 crises of contemporary capitalism: the economic crisis, the inter-imperialist rivalry, the climate crisis, migration crisis, and most dramatically, perhaps the pandemic. And since we met then, I think all of those crises have continued, if not gotten worse, all around the world. I won't go into the other 3, but I'm going to focus on 2, which I think are the primary ones that drive the others, and that is the economic crisis and the inter-imperial rivalries that are sharpening in our world. So to begin with the economic crisis, we are now perhaps around 10 years into what Michael Roberts has called a long depression. That long depression was caused by the drop in profitability and overaccumulation of capital in the world system. And that overaccumulation and drop in profitability caused the Great Recession that swept the world in 2008 and 2009. That brought an end to the long neoliberal boom that we experienced from the early 1980s all the way up to 2008. And since then, we've been stuck in what Roberts calls a long depression, or David McNally calls a global slump of slow growth, repeated recessions, and weak recoveries. Now, of course, that doesn't mean a permanent state of recession. Our rulers did drag ourselves out of the global recession back in 2008 with huge bailouts, stimulus packages, that got the economy up and running, but it did not trigger a new round of expansion of the system. It didn't overcome the problem of overaccumulation and low profitability, and in fact exacerbated it because it kept so-called zombie firms alive, unprofitable firms that in a serious recession would be driven out of business and restore space for the economic system to recover. On top of that, we've had very weak investment in the real economy, and instead a lot of investment in the stock market and other forms of speculative investment. So that was how they got out of the Great Recession. China, perhaps most dramatically, became the epicenter of global growth by conducting the biggest state stimulus and investment program of any of the capitalist countries around the world. And it became for several years the only real center of capitalist growth in the system. That built up all sorts of problems internally that I don't have time to go into, but for a while it became the epicenter of global growth. So since the end of the Great Recession, the system has been growing slowly up until the pandemic recession. But before the pandemic recession, profitability and slowing growth was already apparent. And the pandemic merely triggered a recession. And that was a deep global recession. And yet again, the states, capitalist states, conducted huge, enormous stimulus, bailout, and this time cash payments to consumers to increase demand. While that got the world economy out of the recession, it didn't spur new investment in the real economy, and that meant it didn't increase the supply of goods going into the market globally. That created a supply problem that was compounded by China's zero COVID strategy, which meant lockdowns, which further disrupted supply chains and disrupted global production chains internationally. This has produced a phenomenon of stagflation that we haven't seen since the 1970s. That is, stagnant economies with inadequate supply to meet the demand that there is, and that's generating inflation, most dramatically in the United States and the European Union, where it's between 8 and 10% inflation, most dramatically in gas and food. So all the centers of global capitalism are stuck in this phenomenon of stagflation and are on the verge of recession or slowing. From the United States to the European Union to Japan to China, they're all mired in stagflation and on the verge of recession. And all of these conditions have been exacerbated by Russia's imperialist war in Ukraine, which compounded the problem of supply on a global scale. It blocked the export of food, grain mainly from Ukraine, but also Russia to key centers of the world. That drove up the price of food. It also has intermittently cut off gas and oil supplies to sections of the world, especially the European Union, which has led to a massive spike in the cost of energy globally, exacerbating the problems of stagflation. In response to this stagflationary dynamic, the world capitalist powers have responded by raising interest rates, which they think will be some kind of solution to this world economic crisis. In reality, it's not working. It hasn't lowered the rate of inflation and hasn't stimulated new investment whatsoever. And it is going to have enormous side effects in the world system. That is, it's making the cost of loans more expensive, and any loans that are taken out in dollars become especially expensive for countries in the global south. That could trigger a global sovereign debt crisis in the developing world, where countries are unable to repay their loans that are denominated in dollars back to the centers of world capitalism, especially the United States and the European Union. This is a very sick global economy. Already, the IMF is warning of a possible global recession. I'm not predicting one, but they are warning of one. This long depression has undermined the unipolar world order that the US has superintended since the end of the Cold War and is sharpening inter-imperial antagonisms on a global scale. Up until the Great Recession, the US had really been the bully of the world economy. didn't face a rival, was incorporating all of its potential rivals into a global system of free trade, globalization, a whole neoliberal world order. And it enforced that against any threats with its military bases all around the world through NATO expansion and through occasional interventions under the cover of the war on terror. So the US was the bully on the block. Three things undermined the position of the United States and gave rise to space for other powers to challenge the US. Number one, the neoliberal boom itself, which brought China online as a new center of global capitalist power, also gave space to Russia to rebuild itself as a nuclear-armed petrostate. The second development was the huge defeat the US suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan, which gave increasing space, especially to Russia and China, to assert their interests in Russia's case in Eastern Europe, in China's case in Asia and the whole world system. The Great Recession was the third one that led to the relative decline of US imperial power because it hammered particularly the US and the European Union. So Chinese and Russian imperialism in response have all become increasingly assertive of their interests. Russia and Eastern Europe, China and Asia, and globally. The US has responded from Obama through Trump and now Biden to shore up its imperial hegemony against all rivals, especially China and Russia. If you look at all their policy documents, they target those as their two key adversaries. And Biden in particular ran, although many people didn't see it and pay attention to it, on restoring US imperial power. That was at the heart of his whole project when he announced America is back. And his goal was to band allies together against Russia and China, China being the main focus for the Biden administration. So he's increased the military budget dramatically, funded US corporations through the new CHIPS Act to ensure that the US has high-tech supremacy, especially in semiconductors, and has consolidated a network of alliances that are expanding. NATO is expanded. He's got the new AUKUS pact with Australia and the UK to push back against China in Asia. And he's strengthened the Quad alliance of Asian powers, all designed to ring around China to push US imperialism deeper into control of Asia against Beijing. So this is all triggered two great crises that we see in front of us today, Ukraine and most recently Taiwan. Putin invaded Ukraine, its oldest colony, to reclaim the old Russian Empire. And the Ukrainian people have fought a heroic struggle of self-determination against that Russian invasion. So we have war in the heart of Europe when you think about it. And the US has used Russia's intervention to expand NATO and to make one of its priorities confrontation with China. This is crazy when you think about it. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization now has one of its priorities intervention in the Pacific against Beijing. So you have a massive expansion of NATO's role in Europe and in the world. Pelosi's trip to Taiwan has brought this conflict with China to a head. China has responded to Pelosi's trip with massive military exercises of a much broader and deeper kind than previously in previous Taiwan Straits crises. And the US is similarly deploying more ships and engaged in all sorts of military exercises in the region. And Taiwan is caught in the middle of these two superpowers trying to find a way to maintain its right to self-determination. All of this has set off an arms race in both Asia and Europe. All the European powers are increasing their military budgets, and the same thing is happening all over Asia. So imperial conflicts are intensifying. So the combination of the economic crisis and imperialist rivalry will intensify political polarization, explosions of struggle from below. These are conditions in which the right can grow as an alternative, a false alternative to the failure of the capitalist establishment to deliver anything for regular people. And it also can trigger massive massive uprisings from below. We've witnessed this over the last decade, beginning with Occupy, the Arab Spring, sweeping through strike waves in Eastern Europe, other waves of mass struggle in the Middle East, as well as Sudan and Sri Lanka most recently, and other explosions like Black Lives Matter and strikes in the hearts of the system, in the heartlands of the system, are on order. All of this offers opportunities for a new left to be born. And I say a new left because the reformist strategies that have dominated the left over recent years are going to hit an impasse. Their strategies of changing things through electoral power is going to confront the limits on states to pass any reforms, creating impasses like we've seen in Latin America and also seen in the US, where huge expectations of reform through electoral means have been strangled by the Biden administration. Gone is the Green New Deal, et cetera. All of this opens an opportunity for the revolutionary left to grow. And the key thing is the politics of that revolutionary left. We have to be clear that we oppose all imperialisms, the US first, but also Russian and Chinese imperialism. We stand in solidarity with all struggles of oppressed people for self-determination. And we are organized for international solidarity from below with a strategy focused on building class and social struggle within countries and across countries against our common enemies in the ruling classes and states that run global capitalism. So the key is that struggle and building revolutionary organization right in the middle of it.
All right. So I was asked to follow up. My name is Andy Sernatinger. I've been asked to talk about sort of the situation in the U.S. It sucks in short. I don't want to. I think like before getting into what's happening, I just want to start by saying like part of the reason why we go into understanding it is to be able to change it, right? So even though this can be overwhelming to talk about, like the series of crises that we face, we want to be able to have a really sober approach, so that way we have the best opportunity to really make changes. So I think I'll start in some ways similar to Ashley, in other ways a little bit different, but I think where I would really start is if we look at the moment that we're in, and towards the end of 2022, it's a very different political moment than the last 5 or 6 years have been, right? Like a few years ago, there was sort of some sentiment that like, maybe the electoral left could make some breakthrough. Maybe, there was some shifting of popular opinion and stuff towards more like left ideas and universal programs and this and that. But for where we are today, like that's mostly gone off the map, and so we have sort of the problem of trying to understand it. So where I think this is similar is as first that, like Ashley was saying, there's an underlying crisis of the capitalist economy that has really not been solved since it appeared in 2008. So that crisis of basically too much stuff making too much without much profit hasn't really been solved. Usually the process of a crisis is about destroying unprofitable firms and making space so that way a new wave of accumulation can grow, and that hasn't exactly happened. The recovery that happened since 2008 was constructed in a few ways. One of them was by taking trillions of dollars and transferring them to private hands to kind of get things moving again. Another part of that was lowering the interest rates basically to zero, so that way you would give out free money. So that way you would try to encourage people to buy houses again and for businesses to invest. And then all of the new jobs that have been created since then have all been low-wage jobs that really can't solve a lot of people's immediate needs, right? So, that crisis has not really been solved, even though we've kind of hit a cool period where there was relative stability and some growth going on starting around 2010, 2011, 2012. And I think that's an important thing to be able to place. Where was this social democratic current coming from in the US? Because historically, those social democratic currents always come when there's a period of growth in capitalism. And now that we're in a recession or entering a recession, a lot of the fortunes that would make that seemingly possible are really drying up. So like Ashley was saying, there's been a kind of recovery from COVID with extremely low unemployment, right? It's about as low as it's ever been. It's under 4%. And then what it's done is given a stronger hand to the labor market. And while that's true, employers have used COVID to be able to squeeze out much more profitability wherever they can and to weaken whatever job restrictions there are, to attack unions. So it's a very contradictory kind of moment, because the low unemployment has also at the same time given some confidence to new organizing like the Amazon labor union and Starbucks workers, because there's not really that much fear that you're going to be replaced. Like nobody can hire because because jobs suck. Where this started to change is that last year, the signs of a new recession had started to already kind of make itself known. The Fed said it would be increasing its interest rates. And so you start to get a sense that all is not well in the US economy. When Biden comes in, he essentially makes two promises. Like these are his goals. One is he's gonna tackle COVID. That COVID had really been mismanaged under the Trump administration, and that the US really was shown to be way worse at dealing with a pandemic than pretty much every country. And then at the same time, he would be reinvesting in infrastructure, so that way the US would be a global hegemon in the future, right? Like the country's falling apart, like bridges are breaking down. The basic stuff that you need to be able to be an economic superpower are all coming apart. So he basically proposes a project of reinvesting in the domestic infrastructure of the country, not because he's a super swell guy that wants to make nice things for people, but because it's economically necessary for capital to be able to expand and have a new wave of growth. The problem is that he fails on both parts of these plans. He doesn't tackle COVID. They go into a whole strategy of getting the vaccine as the sole deterrent, right? So they end all the lockdown. There's no more incentive to stay at home. They I don't think coincidentally every Democratic office holder moves to a full reopen of the economy practically at the same time. So the real test of this was earlier this year with the Chicago Teachers Union, when COVID rates were just spiking and they were ordered to return to instruct, and basically the entire Democratic establishment came out against the union and said everybody's got to go back to work. So I think that this has been a general failure on the Biden administration's part, is that they said they were going to be able to tackle COVID. They moved only to a vaccine as their way to deal with it. They basically gave up on it last summer. They said, well, pandemic is over as Omicron is introduced. So they moved into a basic COVID denialism, and now that's the general policy. Like it's indistinguishable, in some ways worse than where we were under the Trump administration. So that part of his program has died. The other part, being the infrastructure bill, which he termed as Build Back Better, is also dead, which is the irony being that a lot of the social democratic left pinned their hopes for getting the reforms that they wanted in labor, for a Green New Deal, this kind of stuff. All of it was tied to the Biden administration. And so, DSA, for instance, started canvassing for Democratic senators in Georgia, not because they had anything to do with the organization's program, but because it was entirely based off of this view that the way to get it was through Build Back Better. That died. I don't need to go over that, but I don't think that that was ever really going to happen. And what we've gotten in its place is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, it's pretty funny that it's called that, I guess, but it's got less than a quarter of the spending that Build Back Better was supposed to have. And it's basically, it's a climate death bill. For all that they say about renewables and stuff, they're opening up an enormous amount of like federal land for drilling, for natural gas expansion, for pipelines. So there's absolutely no way that we're even going to make the Paris agreements based off of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. So here we end up with a Biden administration that's essentially continuing a lot of the policies of the previous two administrations. Policing has increased, not decreased, after BLM, right? Despite like a generalized movement to deal with police violence in any way, we didn't come away with less money for police. We've come away with more and a greater surveillance state. And like the Obama administration, a way increased, set of like border enforcement, immigration detention, and I mean, it really kind of same shit, different day, I guess. So this is sort of where we're at in this political moment, right? There's a general crisis of profitability. We're in an international context where the U.S. is still trying to maintain its dominance, but it hasn't lost its dominance, but it's declining in its relative power, and it makes for a very unstable situation. The right is basically set up to slaughter them during the midterm elections. Biden's approval rating is less than 40% now, give or take. And what they're hoping for is a strategy that has played out in Wisconsin, where I'm from, for the last 10 years, of saying like, we're not those guys who are worse than us, which motivates exactly nobody. So they've attacked their base in a large way by abandoning any of the social program that got people out there. They lost on Roe, and now they're trying to use this election as a referenda on Roe. But there seems to be no general strategy for how are we going to reclaim abortion. Whether this was an overstep by Republicans to attack Roe v. Wade or not, the effect is the same, that we have lost the federal right to abortion. And now we're at a place where the right is set up, and I think most of the social democratic left is now kind of abandon any of the pretense that we're going to get something like a reformist socialism through electoral means, and they've gone straight to lesser evilism. The irony for this, I'm going to close up now, is that really attaching a left program to the Democrats, I've tried to explain in a lot of ways that what's happening is that the Biden administration and the Democrats with them have set to managing capitalism in this particular moment in one way, right? That they're not in any way trying to do something that would be an anti-capitalist, regime or anything like it. And this like make-believe game that is being played, where we're somehow marching towards socialism with that, is it's just a delusion at this point. And worse than that, right, is that the majority of people view institutions in this country, basically every standing institution, is illegitimate. And here we have a left that is trying to say, like, no, actually, let's double down on the institutions of society, of electoral systems and all that. And that's going to be good for us. So it's wildly out of whack with the general sentiment. So I'll have to leave it there. There's a lot more that can be said. I'm sure that it'll come out in the discussion. But fundamentally, a left in this period has to view itself as an oppositional left and independent, so that way we're moving forward on the issues that matter to us and not attaching it to someone else's fortune. All right, thank you.
Hi, comrades. My name is Kristen Godfrey. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about anti-oppression and kind of assessing where we are now after the pandemic and an uprising, right? Where we saw the most people in the history of this country get into the streets. So I want to start with a quote by a good comrade of mine named Devin Springer. They say, and I think this quote will kind of put into perspective how important a moment like this that we're in right now is, in the stakes that we're dealing with, right? So they say, quote, "I think the stakes right now, the deteriorating earth, the oceans, land, and air giving us approaching deadlines for salvation, and the white supremacist, carceral, capitalist, cis, heteropatriarchal US empire counting down the days until it is all too late to shift course. And I now think of abolition as every radical act that we do with great intention to try before it is too late. It is everything that we do, which eats away like acid at the prison walls, at the empire, at the police budgets and police unions, at their bullets, at their black sites across the country, at their asylums where they make people seemingly disappear, at their sanctions and dirty wars, at their borders, which were drawn without legitimacy. It is everything we do now to build away from capitalism and imperialism before we once again run out of options," end quote. So to build away from this capitalism is to build for socialism. And to do that, we must constantly be in struggle, and struggle must be multiracial and trans as hell, and include disability justice. And we have to use the tools given to us like abolition and intersectionality to get us to this socialism. But how do we do this while living in a moment where it seems like history is moving backwards and the right wing is winning? When our side isn't organized and Democrats continue to let us down by actually using racism and transphobia. We have to be able to explain what happened after the 2020 uprising and figure out a way to increase democratic spaces for debate and build organizations where people can join and struggle and be held accountable when we mess up. We need a movement that just can't mobilize, but can also organize and have radical relationality, which I think we are missing. First, we must talk about the successes of the uprising because there were many. There is a new generation of workers who were radicalized, who are now in organizations and fighting back against the system. A generation of trans youth who have walked out of their schools to fight back against anti-trans bills. We also learn the importance of understanding how police murders work and how they get people into the streets. Because Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, she tells us that police killings are the most visceral evidence that your citizenship means nothing in a country that builds borders to feed its insatiable hunger for violence. Other successes have included the toppling of racist monuments of Confederate generals, Spanish conquistador, racist sports mascots. We were able to use decolonization and abolition to show up and fight. All the while, both Democrats and Republicans scoffed at the protests. We saw how the ruling class used land and race to destroy Black, Brown, Indigenous people. People burned down police stations and other places in their neighborhoods that they didn't own. And police were the enforcers of land theft that Indigenous people know all about too well. They defend corporate America, they defend property owners, and police uphold segregation. People made these connections, and we must be thankful that those connections were made. We saw that after the uprisings in the midst of the pandemic, what was in the midst of the pandemic, which showed the enormous inequality that exists in the US, where working class Black, Brown, Indigenous people were not only dying in huge numbers, which I would call state-sanctioned violence, but wages decreased, groceries went up, less jobs provided healthcare. Democrats were successful in pushing all anger into getting the Democrats elected in November. We were coming out of a presidency that was so violent and successful in building a far right. Not only did Trump increase competition amongst workers, but he also spewed ideas that actually did increase this personal bigotry, and we saw an increase in racist hate crimes. All energy went into elections so that Dems could work on getting bills passed that defunded the police. But we see today that Biden has increased military and police budgets, that Palestinians are still being murdered from the increased funding from the US. Energy also went into getting people of color elected, right? Relying on this layer of Black rich elected officials who are rewarded for keeping the status quo afloat. But there was plenty of money, and that money from corporations started huge campaigns to fight racism. Wow. It didn't go to meeting people's actual material needs, though. It paid for trainings that called for more diversity and inclusion, where trainers focused on personal bigotry and teaching about white privilege and identity politics. Dems and corporate America once again successfully made sure that the bulk of American society couldn't figure out this relationship between racism and the economic system of capitalism. Having a good assessment of the past will hopefully put us in a place where we can organize and be a part of movements, because we saw that the uprising was not started by liberals or the left, which means that there are plenty of workers that we need to be speaking to and asking them to join in organizations and struggle. We must integrate the fight against anti-Asian racism, which we saw an increase in this anti-Asian racism during this time, not hate, but racism, right? In the fight against capitalism and white supremacy. Conversations on anti-oppression and race are not and cannot be this black-white binary. They have not got us far. And we have to combine Asians and other ethnic groups, not as this privileged group against the Black people who are screwed, right? We must understand that Europe not only underdeveloped Africa, but it also colonized Asia since the 15th century. That having frameworks rooted in understanding primary accumulation, the settler colonialism and stealing of land and murdering indigenous people, and the enslavement of Africans is the reason for the rise of capitalism in Europe and the exploitation of immigrant labor. The Red Nation says, quote, "The hand that picked the cotton that was weaved in English textile mills were African, stolen from their homelands and enslaved by European masters. The land where the cotton grew had to be cleared of indigenous people and indigenous title to make way for the plantation economy, the main driving force behind the expansion of modern capitalism. Thus, the expansion of African slavery fueled the dispossession of indigenous peoples." End quote. So we must think internationally, we must fight imperialism, and we must combine our struggles with struggles of the global South. We have to deal with the fact that Democrats aren't helping us, but fooling us to increase systemic racism, ableism, and transphobia. Liberals are actually working against transliberation, with well-meaning liberal parents oftentimes speaking over their trans kids. The Human Rights Campaign, who took over all the work being done by the frontliners, putting a cute little bow on it, right? Liberals also talk about bodies in this violent binary way, and the Democrats and the NGOs, they can't be the ones giving us these selective accommodations, which Eric calls in this really good article he wrote. And you know, they can't be praised for these selective accommodations that they give us, right? While the number of trans people being murdered is increasing every year. Kianga says that racism is so much more than bad ideas that you can talk your racist dad in and out of, and that's absolutely true. But to base a whole fight around racism being bad ideas and personal bigotry shows us just how low expectations are of what kind of fight is needed to get rid of racism. Caree Peterson Smith says that Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, and working class people are literally living in a whole other universe, an alternative universe where people can kill you and get away with it, where even if you have documentation, a cop can sit on your neck for 9 minutes and kill you and smirk. A universe where there's no segregation laws to keep you from living somewhere, but systemic racism that won't let you rent a place or buy a house, where your wages are low and you can't provide for your family, where disabled people are deemed disposable, where racism is a permanent feature of your everyday life. So we have to think about how we win workers over who are working to connect the dots to understand how racism really works, how it is intertwined with capitalism. We must have arguments against ideas like white privilege as the sole way to fight for racism, that actually we have to fight for so much more than privilege, and white privilege is upheld by violence and death. That when Black wages decrease, so do the wages of poor and working class people. That when the boss goes after your immigrant coworker, he's coming for you next. That white, poor, and working class people do not benefit from racism. We have to think through how liberalism uses white nationalism to uphold racism, using things like identity politics, which decreases the possibility of this needed multiracial anti-racist movement. That things like blood quantum and white passing politics just make it harder for workers to fight back against an economic system that's literally killing us. So I want to end on a quote from George Jackson. It is Black August, so what's a better time than to think through this anti-racist struggle that we need? That Black August was kind of started in the 1970s after the uprisings and the racism that was taking place at San Quentin Prison. So George Jackson says that we must settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done, discover your humanity and your love for revolution. So thanks, comrades, for having me. I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Kristen. We're going to move straight into me. My name is Elizabeth Lalasz, and I've been asked to speak about labor perspectives and talk about. I'm going to be talking about it mainly from the U.S., but I know that there are international people attending, so please, of course, bring that into the discussion. I spoke in January on a Tempest event titled "Striking Back: Labor Strategy in the Pandemic," and I look back at those remarks that we republished on our website. And I think something I said holds true today. I said, as the pandemic goes into its third year, it continues to be a catalyst for continued radicalization and working class consciousness. It has accelerated dissatisfaction, sometimes explosively, with the pre-COVID working conditions that we have been suffering under, which were abysmal for many, many workers, coupled with a growing awareness of the massive inequality between the rich and the working class. And we've continued to see this play out over the last 6 months since January. There's been an increased unionization activity, reflected most notably in retail, where Starbucks and Amazon workers are leading high-profile campaigns, and with continuing strikes and collective actions going on. Workers' self-activity within workplaces has moved across industries and seems to be deepening. Just a minute. We know about the Great Resignation, now also called the Great Reshuffling, with workers leaving their jobs in droves over the last year or so. According to a Pew poll, majorities of workers who quit a job in 2021 say low pay, no opportunities for advancement, and feeling disrespected at work were reasons why they quit. At least a third say each of these were major reasons why they left. And other workers decided to stay in their workplaces and form unions to demand better pay, better working conditions, and respect. As part of this, workers pointed out that their bosses made record profits during the pandemic at their expense as frontline workers. And with a tight labor market, this has allowed workers to begin to win union recognition, creating what would be called, could be called a domino effect across industries, as one victory inspires others. According to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, during the first 9 months of the fiscal year 2022, which is, they have it from October 1st to June 30th, union representation petitions filed increased 58%. By May of fiscal year 2022, petitions exceeded the total number of petitions filed in all of fiscal year 2021. Workers are also standing up against union busting with a determination not seen in recent times. John Logan, a professor at San Francisco State, who's often quoted in the mainstream media on Starbucks and Amazon organizing, said this. He said, anti-union consultants are often no longer as effective because workers and their attitudes have changed. Workers, especially younger workers, workers of color, are braver about speaking out. They're using social media to outmaneuver the consultants, and they're embracing highly effective strategies like worker-to-worker organizing and interrupting so-called captive audience meetings where consultants discuss the supposed evils of unions. Also significantly, workers have begun to organize independent of existing unions. Last fall, we talked about how rank and file strikers rejected their union's leadership's tentative agreements at Nabisco, John Deere, and Kellogg. The development of independent unions, starting with the Amazon Labor Union, the ALU victory in Staten Island in the spring, has expanded amongst other Amazon workers nationally and into other employers, most recently into Trader Joe's. And this is while the percentage of workers within unions are low, along with strike numbers, according to official numbers. But we need to look at more and say, without a doubt, something is shifting within the working class. It's taking the majority support for unions that has been going on for decades in polls and making it concrete. What is happening is helping to rethink what we believe is possible within labor. None of it should be downplayed. It's our hope for the future, a future which since January, really, and prior to that, but as we've laid out here, has become really quite grim. It's been one crisis after another, from the war in the Ukraine to skyrocketing inflation, to the overturning of Roe, mobilizing by the far right against LGBTQIA folks, continued attacks on critical race theory, accelerating climate change, and critical shortages of workers. And this is all under a Democratic administration trying to complete the, quote, going back to normal phase of the pandemic, to fully open the economy for business interests at the expense of working people's lives. But people know that COVID is not over and that more variants and more sickness will come. To come back to the Tempest labor panel in January, someone else spoke on it, Kim Moody, and what he said, I think, is something that is worth repeating. He spoke about how a tight labor market would not last indefinitely and how we need to take advantage of this window to organize, because that window would, and as we've talked about, is closing. The multiple crises of the capitalist system at this juncture, which the COVID pandemic has accelerated, includes a downturn in the economy. I mean, my fellow panelists spoke about that, a recession that's been there and is going to get worse, which the bosses and the politicians in the US, regardless of Democrat or Republican, don't have a solution for that won't result in further suffering for the working class. Inflation is having a significant impact on workers' abilities to live day to day. It's 8.5%, a bit down from its 40 years high, mainly, and that's just been in the last month or two, mainly due to a decrease in gas prices. But food inflation and electricity price inflation continue to accelerate. Mainstream media stories just proliferate about how wages aren't keeping up with the price of gasoline, food, utilities, and rent. And there doesn't seem to be an end to it. The climate crisis is affecting workers in unprecedented ways, like extreme heat. Joe Allen wrote in a recent Tempest article titled "Dropping Like Flies, How Will UPS Workers Survive Another Summer Without AC?" in which he recounts the story of a young 24-year-old UPS driver, Esteban Chavez, who collapsed and died at the end of his shift due to working in 90-degree temperatures all day with no air conditioning in his truck. With the Great Resignation, labor shortages are at crisis levels, with fewer workers doing more, affecting the functioning of whole societal infrastructures like public education and healthcare. According to the National Education Association, the NEA, the largest union in the United States, there's a shortage of 300,000 educators and support staff going into the beginning of this school year. A survey done in April of this past year shows that up to 47% of US healthcare workers plan to leave their positions by 2025. That's in 3 years. A tight labor market will likely have the opposite effect of what it's having now once a recession fully hits. Workers may tolerate increasingly worse wages and working conditions to just keep their jobs. Bosses are already lining it up right now. Just look at the railroads, where they're trying to cut back. They've deregulated the railroads for decades, but they're trying to cut back from having 2 workers per train to 1. And it's no surprise that there's talk of a strike for the first time since the 1990s. That's working conditions, among other things, going on with that particular struggle. So for us as socialists, trying to make sense of these different crises to come to an understanding of each is crucial right now. For example, understanding that corporate profits have contributed disproportionately to inflation is important, and not just the snarls in the logistic and distribution networks, as the news stories would have many people believe. Connected to this, it's about knowing how these crises are integrally connected to the system of capitalism. And finally, to being able to understand that the self-activity of workers from below is the essential element to fighting these crises. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It's going to be very difficult, but having that understanding that it's not going to come from above, but it's going to come from below, from us. So that's about having a political framework alongside any concrete organizing that we do within our workplaces is really a key. And it isn't an abstraction. These crises are raising all sorts of political questions amongst, our coworkers, which we as socialists should engage with. For example, in just the last number of months, I've been asked, why is it we struck last year? That was for the first time in 40 years, won good pay and staffing language, but we seem to be doing worse. Why are gas prices so high? How did we lose Roe versus Wade? Why didn't Biden make things better? And is there any way to stop global warming? This framework is important as we move into the fall and the midterm elections, which typically pushes workers away from self-activity and into voting as the primary solution. We can already see this with Roe, where the push is to vote for Democrats who have done little to nothing as a party to protect abortion right over the decades since it became legal. We need to mobilize union members, co-workers to abortion rights demonstrations, remembering how Roe was actually won in the first place, and that was by mass mobilizations. And we need to connect these crises to our labor fights. Workplaces over the pandemic have become sites of real struggle, and in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. And so this is part of reconnecting socialists into the labor movement and rebuilding networks of militants. It's not just about having more socialists in workplaces. It's about developing more socialists amongst the people we already know, and in all cases with a political framework to fight their bosses, our bosses, and the system we live under. We need to continue to take modest steps now in this, especially with the recession on the horizon and all the crises the system has put before us, as everyone has talked about. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to thank you to the presenters. This was a heavy lift. We've had Ashley, who weighed in on the global economy and imperialism, Andy, who spoke to us about US politics and the dead end of social democracy, Kristen, who spoke to us about the state of the anti-oppression struggles, and Elizabeth, who just wrapped us up by talking about the state of the labor movement. The next portion of the meeting will not be recorded. This will be an open discussion. In order to participate in the discussion, if you can type your name in the chat or type the word stack in the chat,